I once believed my husband died of a heart attack until I dug up his skull buried under Bolivian soil next to the words, "the traitor." And worse, my own daughter led him there. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next jaw-dropping episode. The kettle had just begun to hiss when Leonora Vance opened the curtains. Morning light hadn't quite made its way over the lake, yet the water still dark and motionless like the surface of an unopened memory. Fog clung low across the shoreline, crawling slowly like fingers reaching for something lost long ago. At 79 mornings were no longer a gentle entry into the day for Leonora. They were calculations: which knee hurt less, which hip clicked louder, which pill to take first. She shuffled to the kitchen in her wool slippers, the cane in her left hand ticking softly against the old wooden floorboards. The silence of the house, once a comfort, now pulsed like an accusation. Still she moved deliberately, stoically, pouring water into her cup, reaching for the tin of rooibos she always said she didn't like, but drank anyway because Edward once told her it helped with inflammation. That was years ago. He had been gone nearly as long as the letter that would arrive today had taken to find her. The mailbox creaked. She didn't hear it, not at first. It was the dog next door, a golden retriever named Toby, who barked once sharply at the sudden figure retreating from her gate. A postman. Not her usual one. She watched his back disappear down the street. No van, no badge. Just a man with a dark blue cap and a canvas satchel like something from another century. Her eyes narrowed. Leonora opened the front door cautiously. The morning was cold enough to nip at her fingertips. There, resting among the usual stack of supermarket flyers and window replacement ads, was a single envelope, yellowed, hand-addressed, foreign. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. The handwriting was precise but old-fashioned, ink not ballpoint, the kind that smudged if you weren't careful. She stared at the return address, San Miguel, Bolivia, and there it was, like a rip through the paper-thin veil of the present. Bolivia. 45 years ago she had boarded a plane from that very country with a fever of 104 and a stomach full of morphine, having lost a man, a map, and a portion of her life that never healed properly. And now this. She stepped back inside the house like someone retreating from the edge of a cliff. The envelope rested on her kitchen table for 5 full minutes before she slid it open with a letter opener shaped like a bronze dagger, an old gift from the faculty at Buenos Aires. Her breath caught as she unfolded the paper. There was no signature, no date, just one sentence in Spanish written with the kind of calm only fear could sharpen. Lo que usted dejó sin enterrar está esperando. What you left unburied is still waiting. Below the sentence taped to the page was a photograph. She sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath her. It was a picture of stone, a weathered fragment, triangular, partially buried in red soil. The top corner bore 3 carvings, glyphs, ones she had once stared at under a Bolivian sun, half mad from dehydration, trying to decipher with a team of skeptical colleagues and one husband who still believed in her. Her hand covered her mouth. She hadn't seen that stone in over 4 decades. It was unmistakable, and it was exactly where they had left it, unmoved, unclaimed, unforgotten. Leonora. The voice crashed through the moment like a rock through stained glass. Serena. Her daughter's footsteps came quickly down the hallway. Leonora had seconds to fold the letter, shove it under the newspaper, and compose her face. By the time Serena entered the kitchen, Leonora was holding her teacup with both hands as if warming them were the only concern on her mind. Serena, in her late 40s, wore that peculiar kind of corporate polish that didn't just reject mud and dust, it feared them. Her heels clicked sharply across the floor. "Morning, Mom. You're up early?" Leonora didn't respond, not at first. Serena didn't wait. "I need to talk to you about the house," she said, dropping her tote bag onto the chair opposite. "You remember that incubator I told you about, for clean tech? Well, there's a round of angel investors next quarter, and I've been told if I come in with liquid assets, they'll prioritize me." Leonora stared into her tea. And this place, well, it's a lot of space for one person, you know. Especially someone who needs help. Leonora said nothing. Serena's tone sharpened. Mom, we've talked about this. You need a place that's designed for your needs, with a nurse, regular check-ins, somewhere safe, practical. Leonora finally looked up. Her blue eyes were pale but piercing like the cold part of a flame. Safe for you or for me? Serena blinked. What's that supposed to mean? Leonora smiled faintly. It's always the same argument. You worry I'll fall. I worry you'll forget who I am. Serena exhaled impatiently. This isn't about identity, Mom. It's about reality. Yes, Leonora said. Her hand moved toward the newspaper covering the hidden letter beneath. Reality. Serena continued, her voice quicker now, more defensive. If we sell this place, you could have the best care possible. The facilities I've researched have art classes, music therapy. Hell, one of them has a greenhouse. You love plants. I love field work, Leonora said dryly. I love heat stroke and shovels and the smell of ancient death. Greenhouses smell like tourists and cucumbers. Serena sat back annoyed. You're impossible. Your father used to say that too. Serena flinched barely, but it was there. Don't bring Dad into this. He made choices you never had to live with. Leonora's jaw tightened. No, Serena, he died. I lived with all of them. The room fell into a silence so sharp even the kettle dared not whistle. Serena stood up. I'll send over the paperwork, she said. You can fight me on it, but eventually the state will agree with me. Leonora didn't flinch. Serena grabbed her tote and headed to the door, then stopped. There's no shame in aging, Mom, but there is in pretending you're not. She was gone a moment later. Leonora sat motionless for a full minute. Then she pulled the letter back out, laid it flat on the table. Her finger traced the carved shapes in the photograph. 3 glyphs, 3 lives. Hers, Edward's, and the one no one had ever dared name. She rose slowly, walking toward the back window. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly. The lake shimmered. A hawk circled above the trees. And for the first time in a long while, Leonora Vance felt something like clarity. She whispered to the empty room, to the dead man who still filled it. If I don't go back there, Edward, I'll be buried with the lie. And then, like the scholar she once was, and perhaps still could be, she went to retrieve the old box in the attic where the broken half of that very same map had waited 45 years to be whole again. 2 days after the letter arrived, Leonora's debit card declined at the pharmacy. It happened with a little beep and an apologetic look from the young man behind the counter, who was too polite to say what his eyes clearly meant. Is everything okay, ma'am? She fumbled for a second card. Another rejection. Her hands didn't shake, not because she wasn't panicked, but because the panic was older than her bones. This wasn't her first time being locked out of something that belonged to her. She walked out without the medication, more insulted by the pity than the inconvenience. That evening, Serena called. No preamble. I canceled the cards. Leonora sat stiffly in her reading chair, staring at the flame of a scented candle she hadn't lit. I noticed. I transferred your main accounts into the trust. It's legally cleaner this way, and you'll still have an allowance for essentials. I already set up automatic refills for your prescriptions. You don't need to worry about managing any of that. Leonora closed her eyes, letting her silence lengthen like a blade. Serena sighed. Mom, you know this is for the best. You need structure, oversight. With the early signs we're seeing. What signs are those? Leonora asked, voice calm but sharp. You're forgetful, impulsive. You isolate. You're clinging to the past in a way that's not healthy. Leonora smiled into the dark. Do you know how many times your father was called impulsive, unstable, dangerous, because he wouldn't lie? Serena was quiet for a beat. Dad was sick, Mom. He was always chasing shadows. And you helped him. No, Leonora whispered. I followed him. Click. Leonora hung up before Serena could weaponize her concern any further. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the window. The Bolivian letter spread open across her lap. The glyphs in the photograph haunting her like ghosts too patient to scream. That word unburied hadn't left her mind. It was a word that hadn't just followed her through time. It had stained it. She had buried her research, buried the questions, buried Edward, and buried herself right alongside them. But time, like soil, shifts, and sometimes the dead don't stay down. By morning, the house felt colder, not in temperature, but in trust. Serena was moving faster than expected. A voicemail had arrived from the bank informing her she would need to submit updated guardianship documentation to access any new funds. Guardianship. Leonora laughed bitterly. 79 years old, 32 published papers, 5 languages, 7 dig sites under her name, and now a woman who couldn't be trusted to buy her own tea bags. She boiled water with mechanical hands and poured it over a cracked porcelain cup, the one Edward had given her in Istanbul back when they still made promises instead of excuses. Guardianship. The word circled her like a vulture. She took the cup, walked slowly to the study, and sat at her desk. The drawer beneath her elbows hadn't been opened in over a decade. The key had long since disappeared, but she'd learned a long time ago that most things don't stay locked when you stop asking permission. She used the heel of her palm, twisted the latch, groaned, and gave. Dust clouded the contents. There weren't many items, just 3, a broken chain, a leather-bound journal, and a folded sheet of parchment wrapped in linen. Leonora didn't touch them at first. She let her eyes study their arrangement the way one might observe a newly uncovered tomb, carefully, respectfully, knowing the story would rewrite you if you weren't careful. She reached for the journal first. Its spine crackled as she opened it, the scent of mildew and iron rising from the pages. The handwriting was unmistakable Edward's, slanted, brisk, almost irritated in its neatness. Each line was dated with militant precision: April 3rd, 1978, April 4th, April 5th. She flipped to the last entry. It was written in pencil, smudged. The red soil here is too soft. Every step feels like a sin. I told Leonora we shouldn't dig without consensus, but the others are impatient. The glyphs, especially the third one, match the old Pachacuti texts. I tried to tell them that. No one listens, especially not Amelia. I think she's feeding information elsewhere. I found something today. Not bones, not gold, not glory. Something colder. The ground bled when I touched it. I don't mean metaphorically. There was moisture, warm, too fresh for a site this old. If we go any further, it won't be science anymore. It will be desecration. But we've come too far. I'll try to talk to Diego tonight. Leonora is right. The map doesn't match the terrain because the terrain moved. But the blood didn't. There was no final signature. Leonora's fingers tightened around the edge of the page, her knuckles pale and silent. She reached for the linen-wrapped bundle. Inside was a torn piece of canvas. A map half complete, age-stained and brittle. The ink had faded, but the glyphs were still visible, angular, ancestral, cruel in their symmetry. The break along the left edge was jagged, torn by wind or time or perhaps intention. It was the map Edward had died for. The one they said had never existed. The one the university had denounced as a hoax. The one Leonora had stopped speaking of because it hurt too much to scream in a language no one believed anymore. She held it up to the light. The same 3 glyphs from the letter. And underneath in Edward's hand one sentence: "What is buried once must remain buried twice to stay hidden." But something had been missed. Something had waited. For decades. And now it was reaching out again. Leonora sat back, eyes glassy, not from tears but from clarity. She saw the expedition again, Valle de la Sangre, 1978. She remembered the heat. The red dust, the tents pitched at odd angles like exhausted travelers leaning against wind. The way Edward used to hum under his breath when cleaning artifacts. How he'd place each piece of pottery in her hand, like it was an infant reverent quiet full of potential. And she remembered the moment the camp had gone quiet. Not because of the weather, not because of exhaustion, but because of what they'd found. A chamber, a door, a carving that no one wanted to admit was written in human bone pigment. She had argued for caution. Edward had argued for truth. The rest had argued for progress. Within 2 days the funding was pulled. Within a week the government had closed the site. Within a month Edward was dead. She was told it was a heart attack. They cremated him quickly. She wasn't allowed to see the body. And just like that, a lifetime of loyalty and excavation was sealed into a medical file and a death certificate stamped and filed. Buried. Leonora leaned over the desk, clutching the map. Her cane tipped over and clattered to the floor. She didn't hear it. She was already somewhere else. Not in the house, not in the lake town, not in America, but in the jungle, in the dust, in the dark. Somewhere, something unburied had just opened its eyes. Milo answered the phone on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep and suspicion. "Grandma, Leonora didn't waste time. I need your help, and I need you to listen to me without interrupting, not as your grandmother, not as someone old, as someone who remembers things better than most people forget." There was a pause on the other end, then the creak of a chair, the sound of him sitting up. "Okay," Milo said, already awake in the way only truth could wake someone. She told him everything in 4 minutes and 27 seconds. The letter, the glyphs, the map, the drawer, the journal, Edward's last words. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, just the facts, like writing a field report through the phone line. When she finished, Milo said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that she feared the connection had dropped. "Then where's your passport?" Leonora exhaled. Serena locked it in the safe, bottom drawer of the file cabinet in her office. "Combination, your birthday." There was a quiet laugh on the other end. "She always liked me more than she said. Or she never thought you'd be the one helping me disappear." They made the plan in whispers. Milo lived 2 hours away. He would drive in under the pretense of a visit. She would feign confusion for Serena, mutter something about needing groceries or vitamins, anything to create the impression of helpless routine. While Serena was distracted, Milo would retrieve the passport, and if luck allowed, bring back the emergency credit card hidden behind the old tax documents. They set the date for Thursday. It rained on Thursday, heavy sweeping sheets that blurred the streetlights into watercolor. Leonora stood in the doorway of her study, holding the valise she'd used during the Damascus excavations in 1982. The leather was cracked at the edges, the brass corners tarnished, but it still closed with that beautiful final-sounding snap inside the torn map wrapped in linen. Edward's journal, a printout of the glyph photograph from the letter, 1 change of clothes, a tin of anti-inflammatory pills, and a black and white photograph of a man standing in the sun holding a bone fragment with a small grin, Edward, age 38, in Bolivia, before anything broke. She zipped it shut with the reverence of someone closing a tomb. Milo arrived exactly at 8:43 p.m. He didn't knock. Just used the spare key she'd once hidden under the geraniums in a rusted Altoids tin. He was drenched rain dripping from his hood onto the hardwood floor, but his eyes were bright electric. He held up a sealed envelope. Passport, card. "I also found a letter Serena wrote to some place called Silverwood Haven. Looks like a care home." Leonora took it but didn't open it. She didn't need to read it. She already knew. "Did she see you?" "No, she's at the gym. Her car's still warm." Leonora nodded. "Good. Help me with the coat." He held out her rain jacket like a butler preparing a queen for exile. She slipped her arms through, slowly grimacing as her left shoulder caught. He adjusted the strap of the bag onto her good side. They didn't hug. There wasn't time. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him and said, "I trust you. That's more than I can say about anyone else alive." Milo blinked, unsure how to respond. So he said the only thing that didn't sound inadequate. "I'll drive you to the airport." They didn't speak much during the ride. The wipers kept a steady rhythm ticking away everything they didn't say. At one point, Milo asked, "What are you hoping to find?" Leonora stared out the window, her voice low. "Proof. Not just of what happened to Edward, but of who we really were." Before Serena made me a footnote, they arrived at the airport just before 11. Milo parked illegally near departure's hazard lights, blinking like anxious heartbeats. He got her a wheelchair despite her protests and pushed her toward the counter. Leonora handed over her passport, her hand not shaking at all. The clerk didn't blink at her destination, La Paz, Bolivia. She had bought the ticket online the night before using a VPN and an old email address from a university that hadn't realized she was still alive. Milo walked with her as far as security would allow. "Once you're through, text me," he said. "I won't." He smiled. "Right, of course." She touched his cheek with the back of her hand just once. "Don't let her make you forget who I was." "I won't," he said. She turned toward the security gate, her body stiff, her knees unkind, but her steps hers. The airport was a mosaic of strangers. Shouts in multiple languages, crying babies, flickering screens of canceled and delayed, but Leonora moved through it like a ghost with a purpose. She boarded without trouble. Seat 21A. Window. She stared out as the plane ascended. When the clouds swallowed the world below, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Edward, I'm coming back to where we left the story untold." The seatbelt sign blinked off. She didn't need sleep. She needed memory, and for the first time in decades it felt sharp again. The way the soil had felt under her fingers that day, the smell of it, the warning in the glyphs, and the sound of Edward calling her name right before he disappeared behind the curtain of lies they never got to pull back together. She didn't know what she'd find in Bolivia, but she knew this. It was no longer about proving anything to academia, or to Serena, or even to herself. It was about giving voice to what had been buried. Not just the truth, but the silence that had protected it for too long. And so, somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, at 37,000 feet, in the middle of a storm, and her 7th decade of life, Leonora Vance began her final expedition. Not with a shovel, but with a memory sharpened into resolve. The wheels touched down with a jolt that pulled Leonora from her thoughts. The plane's brakes growled against the wet runway, and outside the window, La Paz shimmered beneath a bruised sky, half rain, half sunset, the horizon bleeding into itself like a memory refusing to settle. She gripped the armrest. Her legs were slow, but her mind sharp as a knife freshly honed. She moved with the steady defiance of someone who had been underestimated for so long. It had become a kind of armor. The airport hadn't changed much, sterile humming caught between efficiency and indifference. She followed the signs in Spanish, though she barely needed them. Her feet remembered. Her eyes scanned for faces that didn't exist anymore, colleagues, porters, even enemies who once walked these halls with her. All gone. Customs waved her through with a courtesy reserved for harmless elderly women. She said thank you in perfect Quechua, and for a moment the agent looked at her like he wasn't sure if she was real. Outside the air was thinner, colder, biting her lungs in that high-altitude way that reminded her of 1978. She found a bench near the taxi queue, sat for exactly 1 minute, and opened her notebook. Inside were 3 names and one hand-drawn route that only she understood. She whispered to herself, Sangre Valley still lies north by northeast, if they haven't paved over it. The map fragment was wrapped in wax paper tucked between her journal and a yellowed photograph of the team, 10 of them once. Now only 2 remained, if that. A boy no older than 20 approached her, thin, wiry, with a driver's tag pinned crookedly to his vest. Senora Taxi, Leonora squinted. To Illimani village, the southern ridge. He blinked. Es muy lejos, señora. Muy peligroso. That's not for tourists. She took out a folded bill, crisp American. His eyebrows lifted. Let's go. The ride took over 4 hours. The first part was paved, smooth, winding roads that betrayed no secrets. But as they left the edge of La Paz, the terrain changed. Asphalt gave way to gravel, then to dirt, then to silence. The boy stopped speaking. He played a tinny radio station for background noise, but even that felt too modern, too alive for where they were headed. Leonora looked out the window at the rising cliffs, the skeletal trees clinging to the slope, and the occasional stone shrine built for no god she recognized. Halfway there they passed a small cemetery. Fenced in by rusted iron, it was filled with crosses made from bone-white wood, some tied with ribbons, others scorched black. She tapped the window once. Stop here. The boy slowed. This place, why? She was already out of the car. The earth here was soft, still damp from last week's rain. Leonora moved through the rows like someone walking an alphabet she once knew by heart. Toward the back, half covered by vines and dirt, was a stone marker. It wasn't hers, but it belonged to someone who had died the same week Edward had a porter named Manuel. Manuel had been the first to descend into the chamber. He had screamed before his body was found, eyes wide open, lungs filled with dirt. They said he suffocated. But there had been no soil in his throat, only on his palms. She knelt, no prayer, just presence. The boy called out, Senora, we have to go. Leonora stood brushing the mud from her knees. Back in the car, the road narrowed. Mountains pressed inward, and then the plateau, Sangre Valley. It was less a valley now, more a wound still crusted with time. Overgrown, forgotten. The field station was long gone, collapsed into rot. But the ridges, the trail markers, the old charcoal survey posts, they remained. Echoes of certainty in a place shaped by uncertainty. The car stopped. "I can't go further," the boy said. Leonora nodded. "You don't need to." He looked at her, genuinely worried. "You'll sleep where?" She smiled. "I've slept in ruins older than your country." He didn't argue. She stepped out. The wind hit her like a warning. From her bag she took out Edward's journal and flipped to the sketch. He had made a crude drawing of the chamber entrance marked by 3 vertical stones and a gnarled tree. She scanned the landscape. Time had shifted the terrain, but not enough. There. She walked toward the base of the hill. Her knees protested, her heart pounded, but she kept going, each step like peeling back a layer of history that had refused to rot. Near the top, the wind carried a sound, faint, metallic, familiar. A bell, small, dull, hanging from a post. It had once marked the camp's perimeter. She touched it gently. It didn't ring, but it moved just enough to whisper, "You're back." The tree was there too. Twisted now, bark half stripped but unmistakable. She crouched beside it and cleared away the brush. The stones had shifted, but the base remained. There was no door, no obvious entrance. But Edward had written, "The soil here breathes. It covers what it cannot erase." She pressed her palm against the ground and it felt warm, like something waiting. She took out the map, aligned it against the journal sketch. The match wasn't perfect, but the glyph positions corresponded. She measured out 10 paces from the middle stone, then 5 right, then down. Her fingers dug slowly, not with tools, but with the resolve of someone who had already been buried once and had no fear of dirt. And there it was. Wood, warped, rotten. A hatch. She pulled once, nothing. Twice a creak. Then it opened. The air below was thick and sweet like flowers growing in decay. She stared into the darkness. Her flashlight flickered to life, thin and trembling. She sat at the edge, her legs dangling, and for the first time in over 4 decades, she said the name aloud, Edward, and then she descended, into what was left, into what still remembered, and above the clouds closed in, and the wind carried no more warnings, only welcome. The stairs descended deeper than she remembered. Dampness clung to the stone walls like breath held too long. Leonora moved slowly, every step echoing in the void. The flashlight's beam wavered, but found the path, a corridor etched with faded symbols, the air growing colder, sweeter, more ancient with each footfall. The space widened. The chamber was there as it had been in 1978, a dome of carved basalt and red clay, half swallowed by earth, half refusing to die. Leonora paused at the threshold. The place had not changed, but something within it had shifted or awakened. She stepped forward. The hatches of the old field locker were still there, rusted shut. But nearby, beneath a slab of slate, a panel had been moved, disturbed, and behind it a crawl space. She hesitated only a second before dropping to her knees. Inside, the space narrowed into a tunnel not taller than her shoulders. She crawled with one hand guiding the flashlight, the other pulling herself through the earth. A rat scurried past. She did not flinch. Then abruptly space opened. A hollow cavity sealed off from light and time, and at its center a crate, weather-worn, metal-banded with the initials EV burned into the lid. Her fingers trembled. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was Edward's second journal, the one she'd never seen, the one Serena said didn't exist. The pages were fragile, water-damaged in places, but intact. She sat on the stone floor, pulled the flashlight close, and began to read. March 28, 1978. They came again last night. Not locals, not thieves, government men. I saw the boots, no dust, polished. They spoke no Spanish, but knew Diego's name. I pretended not to hear. Today we found the ossuary. At first it looked like a burial site, but the bones, they were too fresh, and the arrangement ceremonial but rushed. These weren't ancient, these were recent. We didn't stumble on a relic, we stumbled on a crime scene. Leonora doesn't know yet. I'm afraid to tell her. Not for her sake, but for ours. They killed them, the remaining elders of the Pachacuti line, buried them with their own scrolls, their own language carved on the walls to make it look authentic. But this wasn't preservation. It was erasure. And the ones who did it, I think they're still watching. I think I'm next. I left the page trembling. The Pachacuti, one of the last surviving lines of the pre-Incan priesthood, had long been considered myth, but Edward had always believed they fled to Bolivia, that their knowledge, their language, their map of symbols was not lost, only hidden, and now he had found the proof, and for that they had buried him too, not in soil but in silence. A sound behind her made her spin, a voice, low, rusted by years. Dr. Vance. She lifted the flashlight. The beam fell on a man older than she remembered, thin skin like smoked paper, but his eyes clear. Diego, she whispered. He stepped forward. You remember. She nodded. How could I forget the only man who believed us back then? He helped her stand. They emerged from the tunnel into the open chamber. He carried a canvas satchel. Inside, sealed in plastic, was a set of documents yellowed and stamped. Found these 2 years ago, Diego said, handing them to her. Someone smuggled them out of an embassy in Sao Paulo. Said they were part of a cultural asset review. Leonora opened the folder. Her hands stiffened at the first page. Confidential, eyes only, CIA internal memo, June 1978. Subject, Dr. Edward Vance. Potential breach of Operation Condor Shield. Edward Vance, currently assigned to archaeological oversight in Bolivia under academic cover, is in possession of field notes indicating awareness of classified counterinsurgency operations and burial of deceased indigenous subjects related to Operation Shield. The subject has demonstrated intent to report findings to international bodies, UNESCO, UNCHR. Recommend preemptive neutralization through health compromise vector cardiac event preferable due to prior condition. Contact source D43V. She dropped the page. The light flickered. Diego didn't speak. Leonora stared into nothing. Her mouth open but no words formed. Cardiac event, she repeated. They gave him a heart attack. They did more than that, Diego said. He unfolded another paper, a crude autopsy report unsigned. It showed hemorrhaging inconsistent with myocardial infarction. It showed traces of digitox in a compound no local clinic would have administered. It showed murder, but that wasn't what broke her. It was the final page. A signed memo, handwriting unmistakable. One name under the intelligence liaison field officer, trust source line. S. Vance. Serena, her own daughter. Leonora's knees gave out before she realized they had. The stone floor was cold. Her lungs ached. She clutched Edward's journal to her chest, but it couldn't steady her. She was only 14, she whispered. She didn't write that. Couldn't have. Diego knelt beside her, eyes wet. But someone used her name as a cover. Leonora nodded. Because if she allowed herself to believe the alternative, she couldn't go on. She couldn't breathe. She sat there in the dark, surrounded by bones and truths that had waited 45 years to speak. And for the first time in her life, she wished she had never come back. Diego lit the lantern. The chamber flickered into warm, trembling gold casting shadows that crawled up the stone walls like the hands of the past finally reaching out. Leonora sat against the far side of the vault. Edward's journal on her lap, her fingers numb, her mind frayed like parchment edges worn by too many unspoken truths. She couldn't stop staring at the signature. S. Vance. She had only one daughter. Only one person with that name. Her voice barely made it past her throat. How could she? Diego didn't answer right away. He moved carefully, unrolling another map onto the ground, not of the terrain, but of events. A timeline. Circled names. Arrows in red pen. He pointed to a faded photograph taped to the top left corner. Expedition Team, Bolivia, 1979. 10 people. And there the smallest face off to the side, holding a notebook too big for her hands. Serena. She was with us, Leonora breathed. I remember her on the tarmac. The embassy said the jungle was too dangerous. But Edward insisted. She was 16, Diego said. Bright, observant, always asking questions. Leonora nodded slowly. That's why they picked her. Diego continued. The Americans needed someone close, someone no one would suspect. And she was perfect, young, impressionable, already fluent in the language of loyalty. No, Leonora whispered. She was a child. She was a weapon, Diego said flatly. Leonora turned to him, her voice breaking. You're telling me Serena betrayed her own father? Gave him up to the CIA like he was some kind of enemy agent? Diego didn't flinch. She didn't know what she was doing. Not at first. But someone filled her ears. fed her stories, said Edward was becoming radicalized by the locals, that his obsession with the glyphs was a cover for revolutionary contact, that the Pachacuti were insurgents. Leonora's eyes filled. She believed them. She was told if she helped, she'd keep you both safe. All she had to do was observe, report, be their little lens. Leonora felt like her body was being pulled apart, thread by thread. Her breaths came in shallow bursts. I remember, she said, her voice far away. Edward yelled at her once, over a journal. Said it wasn't a toy, that she'd copied something wrong. Because she hadn't copied it, Diego said. She'd rewritten it, edited the glyphs to hide what he'd found, then handed that version to a man named Paul Delmar, your U.S. Embassy attaché. He was CIA under cultural cover. A memory thundered through her. La Paz, 1978. A night soaked in rain and tension. Serena crying behind a closed tent flap. Edward pacing furious. "You don't know what you've done," he had shouted. Leonora had entered too late. Just fragments, Edward trembling. Serena white as ash. A notebook on the table, torn pages, smeared ink symbols redacted. Edward had left the next morning alone, saying he needed time. And then came the call, cardiac arrest, sudden, tragic. At the time it made sense. Now it was a crime scene. Leonora buried her face in her hands. She killed him, with her silence. No, Diego said gently. She killed him with her trust. Leonora snapped her head up. And what did that trust cost? Everything. Silence stretched between them. In the quiet, Diego unzipped his coat and took out a recording device, old analog, with a tiny cassette already loaded. "She left this," he said. 5 years ago, dropped it in my mailbox in a plain envelope. No note, just a recording. I never knew why. Until now." He pressed play. The tape hissed. Then Serena's voice, younger, less cold, but trembling. "If anyone finds this, I was 16. I didn't know what they were asking me. They said it was just observation, that he was becoming obsessed and they were afraid he'd defect. I thought they meant he was sick, like in the mind. I didn't know they meant to kill him." Leonora's jaw clenched. "I wrote things in the report they asked for. I didn't think it would go anywhere. I didn't think the embassy even cared. And when Dad died, they told me it was natural, that my help saved the expedition from scandal. They told me I saved you." Leonora couldn't breathe. "But I didn't save anyone. I buried him." Click. The tape ended. The chamber was dead quiet again. Leonora stared at the lantern as if it might offer clarity. "She kept that secret for over 40 years, she said." Diego nodded. "And when she couldn't carry it anymore, she sent a whisper. Not to me. To you." She was afraid, he said, and ashamed. Leonora clenched her fists. "She was 16, she repeated. But she grew up. And when she did, she rewrote history. Made me small. Made me dependent. Like a way of keeping her guilt locked away." She stood. Suddenly the years seemed to peel off her like old paint. "I need to look her in the eyes." Diego nodded again. "I'll get you to the embassy. There are still people who remember." Leonora took a last look around the chamber, once sacred, now stained. Edward didn't die because he believed in myths, she said. He died because he told the truth. She picked up his journal, kissed the cover once, and whispered, "I'm not done." The wind had picked up by the time Leonora reached the clearing above the excavation site. The trees whispered with the dry hush of memory, and the soil beneath her boots felt alive with the weight of the dead. She stood alone in the shadow of the ridge, the collapsed field tent behind her, Edward's journal clutched tight in her left hand. The map fragment was pressed against her chest, like a relic of a faith she was still trying to believe in. Then she heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel, too recent to be from Diego's old truck. A black SUV pulled up. Glossy, foreign, out of place in the dirt and bones of this forgotten world. The driver stepped out first, a man in a suit, sunglasses, leather briefcase. Then another, a woman with the unmistakable look of a federal agent. And then Serena. Her hair was pinned, her blouse too clean for the jungle, but her face, it wasn't the cold, distant Serena from home. This one looked older, hunted, tired. Leonora didn't move. Serena walked toward her, holding a manila envelope. "Mom." Leonora narrowed her eyes. "You don't get to say that today." Serena nodded once, lips pressed tight. She handed the envelope to the suited man. He stepped forward and extended it like a priest offering last rites. "This is a formal request for extradition," he said, "filed by U.S. representatives in coordination with Bolivian internal affairs. You've been reported missing with potential cognitive decline. For your safety and per your daughter's legal authority, we're requesting your voluntary return to the United States." Leonora didn't even blink. "Cognitive decline," she repeated. Serena stepped closer. "Mom, please. You've been chasing ghosts in a jungle that doesn't want you here. You're 79. You could get hurt, or worse." Leonora smiled a tired, bitter curve of the lips. "And you think locking me in a care facility will protect me from the jungle? Or from you?" Serena flinched. "That's not fair." "No," Leonora said. "Fair would be Edward still alive." Serena froze. Leonora turned to the suited man. "Get off my mountain. You're not the legal. I'm not your client. I'm not your case. I'm the only living witness to a genocide your government buried under paperwork and jungle moss." She turned back to Serena. "You brought lawyers to a burial site." Serena's voice cracked. "I brought them to protect you." Leonora took a step forward. "Is that what you told yourself when you were 16? The clearing went dead quiet. The suited man looked between them and slowly backed away. Leonora's voice dropped, not loud but sharp as bone. "You didn't just betray your father. You rewrote his death certificate. You turned a murder into a medical record. You buried him in bureaucracy and called it mercy." Tears welled in Serena's eyes, but she blinked them away. "I was a child," she said. "So was he?" Leonora snapped. "He died with your name in his report, a line of code that cost him his breath." Serena broke. "No," she shouted. "He died because you brought us here, because you couldn't let it go, because you made archaeology a religion and sacrificed your family on the altar of your damn symbols." Leonora stared. "I didn't want this," Serena cried. "I didn't want bones and glyphs and campfires filled with screams. I wanted to be home. I wanted to be your daughter, not your assistant." Her voice cracked into rawness. "You never chose me." Leonora's lips parted, not in argument but in realization. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was fallout. The jungle pulsed around them, uncaring, ancient. The air hung with the weight of 4 decades pressed between them like layers of dust refusing to blow away. "I thought I was protecting you," Leonora said at last. "You were protecting the work," Serena whispered. "You always were." They stood like statues, one carved by guilt, the other by grief. Leonora finally stepped forward, her voice hoarse. "I lost him, I know, but I didn't mean to lose you too." Serena turned her face away, but not before a tear fell. Leonora reached into her coat and pulled out Edward's journal. "I want you to read this," she said. "Not as evidence, not as history, but as a letter from your father to the daughter he thought he still had." Serena didn't take it. Leonora pressed it to her chest. "You still can." Serena looked at the jungle, at the trees, at the bones beneath them, then finally at her mother. And for the first time she didn't see a myth chaser. She saw a woman who had spent her whole life trying to dig her way back to the truth and to her child. "I'm not ready," Serena whispered. Leonora nodded. "I wasn't either." The wind carried the sound of a bird overhead, a call like mourning in motion. The suited man approached again cautiously. "Should we proceed?" Leonora didn't answer. Serena did. "No, cancel the request." He looked stunned, but I said cancel it. She's not coming back with us. He stepped back. Serena finally stepped forward, gently placed a hand on her mother's shoulder and whispered, "Let's finish this." The first strike of the shovel hit stone. It echoed not loudly, but with a finality that made both women freeze. Leonora steadied her hands, though the years had stolen her strength. The sun was beginning to fall behind the ridge, casting slanted light through the trees, golden and ancient. Serena stood beside her, silent, a dust mask over her mouth, gloves half tucked. She hadn't spoken since they entered the site together, and yet everything between them had changed. The earth had changed. This wasn't archaeology anymore. This was mourning. Leonora bent down, fingers brushing away the thin layer of dirt. The texture shifted damp clay, then ash, then the hard resistance of something carved. A slab. She looked at Serena. Then both women knelt. They worked slowly. No words. Just breath. Just silence. The kind of silence that hums with history. Piece by piece the stone emerged, rectangular carved edges darkened by time. And in the center glyphs, unlike any the museums had ever accepted as real. But Leonora knew them. So did Edward. So did the Pachacuti. She wiped the slab gently with the edge of her scarf, revealing the central mark, the spiral sun, the ancestral crest of the line of priest scholars. Below it a name, Kan Pachacuti, and another, and another. Serena read them aloud, her voice shaking. Ima Pachacuti, Tika Pachacuti, Lahuari Pachacuti. A family tree turned into a gravestone. Leonora didn't cry. She'd shed too many tears in this soil to waste any more. Instead, she reached into her field satchel and pulled out Edward's journal. Flipping past pages, she found the diagram. The glyphs matched. Every single one. He had been right. The place, the slab, the names, everything he risked, everything he lost was here. Serena whispered, "It's a mass grave." Leonora nodded. Serena looked at her. This wasn't a myth. Leonora replied low and steady. It was never meant to be. They kept digging, and as the slab gave way, they found what it had guarded, bone after bone, lined and layered, not with the grace of ceremonial burial but the cruelty of disposal. Skulls stacked beside femurs, wrist bones still tied with sinew as if bound even in death. Serena dropped her gloves. She sat down hard beside the pit. I thought you were chasing ghosts," she whispered. Leonora sat beside her. "No," she said. "I was chasing what the world wasn't ready to believe." Serena didn't reply. She just stared into the grave. It wasn't just bones. There were beads, woven cords, tiny tools, a child's flute. Lives, not myths. They sat there for a long time, mother and daughter, not arguing, not proving, just witnessing. For the first time in years, their silence wasn't a wall. It was a bridge. Serena's voice finally broke through. "I sent them reports," she said quietly. "The embassy. I was so sure you'd gone mad. You kept talking about bloodlines and symbols and justice. I thought it was obsession, but you were right." Leonora didn't speak. Serena reached over and took her mother's hand. "Softly, I believe you now, because I see it." Leonora's fingers tightened. "Edward died for this," she said. "And now, maybe we don't have to." They began documenting everything. Serena set up the field camera, the same one Edward had once used. Leonora arranged the journals, maps, fragments. Every item placed with reverence, with anger, with truth. They took photos of the slab, the glyphs, the bones, the bindings. Serena typed notes into a satellite laptop, sending encrypted drafts to contacts at UNESCO and the UN Human Rights Committee. She had left the embassy, walked away from the polished offices and glass towers. Now she was here in dirt and bloodline and reckoning. "We'll need witness protection," she said, "once this gets out." Leonora smirked faintly. "Let them come." Serena smiled, for the first time genuinely, and then she asked quietly, "Can we bury them?" Leonora looked into the grave. She nodded. Together they gathered the bones, carefully, as if returning names to bodies. They dug a deeper space near the original slab, laid the remains inside with cloth and flowers, and names whispered like prayers. Serena lowered a child's flute last. Then she stood. No tears, only silence again, sacred this time. They packed up the evidence, zipped the bags, sealed the drives. As they walked back toward camp, Serena turned to her mother. "Tell me something," she said. Leonora looked over. "If we hadn't found this, would you have kept going anyway?" Leonora didn't hesitate. "I would have died trying." Serena smiled, not sad, not angry, just knowing. "Then let's live to finish it." They walked on the jungle, finally quiet behind them. History had been unearthed, and this time it would not be buried again. The wind in Montana was colder than she remembered. The lake outside her cabin glistened under a sharp morning sun. Autumn had begun creeping in, frosting the edges of the trees with gold as if nature itself was preparing for one final draft. Leonora Vance sat at the oak writing desk by the window, wrapped in a shawl the color of soil and sky. The same one Edward gave her after Bolivia, when they still believed the world could be changed with discovery alone. But now there were no more dig sites, just this final map. She adjusted the ribbon on her typewriter and began to write. Chapter 27, Blood and Silence. The keys clacked like old bones, rhythmic, patient, deliberate. Her manuscript had grown thick, 400 pages of confessions, findings, names that had never seen justice. A tapestry of anthropology, politics, betrayal, and truth. The title sat at the top of the first page like a wound. The Broken Map, Bloodlines, and Betrayal. This wasn't a memoir. It was a reckoning. The door creaked behind her. She didn't turn. "Milo." "Yeah," came the soft reply. Her grandson entered a warm thermos in hand. He placed it on the desk gently, his eyes scanning the pages. "You're on the last chapter," he said. Leonora smiled faintly. "Almost. I just have to decide if I'll end it with rage or grace." He chuckled. "Can't you do both?" She paused. That might be the most honest choice of all. Milo sat on the arm of the nearby couch, hands folded. "Are you scared of finishing? Of what comes after?" Leonora looked at the lake. "No," she said. "I've been scared for most of my life. Scared I was wrong. Scared I was alone. But not anymore." She reached into the drawer and pulled out a smaller notebook, worn leather-bound, filled with red edits. "Edward's handwriting." She handed it to Milo. "This stays with you," she said. "If something happens to me before I finish, you finish it, word for word." Milo's throat tightened. "Grandma." "No protests," she said, soft but firm. "You're the only one who still knows how to listen between the words." He nodded slowly. There was a knock at the door. Leonora didn't move. Milo stood and answered it. Serena stood on the porch. No coat, no papers, just her. She looked at Milo, then past him at the woman inside, still seated like a monarch of memory. "Hi," she said. Milo stepped aside. Serena entered the cabin, pausing near the bookshelf, the one her mother had filled with journals and forgotten languages. She looked different, lighter, as if some invisible yoke had finally fallen off her shoulders. Leonora turned slightly in her chair. "I wasn't expecting you. I wasn't sure I'd come." They stood in silence. Then Serena walked forward and stopped at the desk. Her eyes fell on the manuscript. She didn't touch it, not yet. "Is that it?" she asked. Leonora nodded. "It's the truth, as much of it as I could find." Serena took a slow breath, then almost unsure reached out and placed her palm flat on the stack of pages. She held it there for a long time, then softly, barely above a whisper, "Me." Leonora closed her eyes. It was the first time she'd heard the word in over 20 years, and it hit deeper than any accusation ever had. Serena opened her mouth to say more, but Leonora stopped her with a gentle shake of the head. "Not now. The story's not done yet." Serena stepped back. Leonora turned to Milo. "Can you give us a moment?" He nodded and left his eyes lingering on both women with quiet reverence. They sat together at the desk, mother and daughter, for the first time, without armor, without calculation. Serena picked up a pencil and began reading page 1. Leonora returned to the typewriter. The lake outside shimmered like memory. Hours passed. At sunset, Milo brought them tea. They didn't speak much. Sometimes the deepest healing doesn't need dialogue, only presence. As night settled, Serena stood and stretched. She looked out the window toward the edge of the lake. "You remember when I was 8, she asked, "and I told you I hated mud?" Leonora laughed. "And then you rolled in it 2 hours later." Serena smiled. "Maybe I didn't hate it. Maybe I just wanted you to pull me out." Leonora looked down at the final page she had typed. She rolled in the last sheet, paused, then typed the final line. The map was never broken, only the hands holding it. She pulled the page from the typewriter and placed it on top of the manuscript. She closed the folder gently. Serena stood behind her, tears silently tracking down her face. Leonora stood slowly, walked to the porch, and sat in the old wooden chair. The moon had risen. The lake was still. She opened her notebook one last time, not to write, but to feel. And then she breathed, and the screen went dark. The only sound, the gentle, steady tapping of typewriter keys, echoing, like truth long buried, finally given voice. 1 year later, the world did not look the same. The book, The Broken Map. Bloodlines and Betrayal had been published quietly by a university press in Vermont. No media circus, no bestseller list, just one old woman's truth etched in paper and passed to the world. But it spread like fire and dry wind. Anthropologists called it a resurrection of suppressed history. Archaeologists called it a rebellion against sanitized pasts. Politicians called it inconvenient. The CIA called it potentially damaging. Within weeks, academic journals were flooded with reactions. Public television in Brazil aired a 3-part special on the Pachacuti genocide. Indigenous rights organizations marched across Bolivia carrying replicas of the glyph-covered slab Leonora had documented. The United Nations opened an inquiry, and the United States Congress reluctantly launched a bipartisan investigation into covert Cold War-era anthropological projects, with Leonora Vance's name cited on the first page of the hearings. She never saw any of it. Leonora had passed away in her sleep 6 months before the publication. The final manuscript had been sent by Milo, wrapped in the same scarf his grandmother had once worn in the Andes. Her death was quiet. Her legacy was not. Serena had changed too. Gone was the tight-jawed diplomat. In her place, a woman who now spoke with the clarity of a witness, not a handler. Serena had resigned from her embassy post 2 days after her mother's funeral. She enrolled in a cultural preservation fellowship, then joined a South American heritage nonprofit as their director of Indigenous safeguards. Everywhere she went, she carried her mother's journal. Milo, now in his early 30s, opened a center for cultural memory and undocumented histories. He taught workshops on glyph reading, decolonizing archives, and the moral responsibilities of memory. His students were mostly young, brown, and angry. He liked it that way. He kept the original slab replica mounted behind his lectern, and on the first anniversary of the book's publication, a museum in Santa Cruz hosted a memorial exhibition titled What Was Buried. It was packed. People came from 5 continents. Artifacts were displayed with quotes from the book. Edward's journal pages, photos of the dig, the last typewritten page. Serena and Milo stood together as attendees read in silence, cried in corners, whispered names of ancestors long denied. At 4:00 p.m. the lights dimmed. A stage was set. Serena took the microphone. She wore no makeup, no podium, no filters. She held one page in her hand. She looked at it, then looked up. "My name is Leonora Vance, and I'm the daughter of the woman who unearthed a silence that spanned generations." She paused. Her throat caught. Her next words were not rehearsed. She wasn't a perfect mother. She wasn't always kind. She chose her work over me more times than I want to remember. But she also chose the truth, and when she chose it, she didn't flinch. Serena wiped one cheek. "I once thought she was delusional, obsessed, dangerous. But what she really was right." She unfolded the page. This is the last paragraph she ever wrote. She didn't know it would be her last, but maybe she did. She read it aloud. "When bones speak, it is not in the language of politics or reputation. It is in the quiet ache of presence, in the unmoving gaze of names carved into stone. And when you listen, truly listen, you realize that history never buried the truth. People did." Serena folded the page. Silence filled the hall. Then one voice clapped, then another. Then the room stood, and the name Leonora Vance was no longer whispered in footnotes. It was spoken. It was remembered. It was honored. And it would never be buried again. The Bolivian sun cast long shadows over the valley. A group of students moved quietly behind Milo as he led them down the narrow path, their boots crunching over red dust, the same trail his grandmother once walked alone and accused. Now they walked it in witness. Milo, older now, beard streaked with silver, stopped at a rise overlooking the site. What had once been a closed wound was now a garden of memory. The soil was marked with hand-carved posts, each inscribed with a name recovered from oral testimonies. Tiny wind chimes made from ceramic shards danced in the breeze. He turned to his students. This was called the Valley of Silence, but it was never truly silent, just unheard. He opened a notebook. One page, yellowed by time, bore his grandmother's handwriting. He read aloud. "People can kill bloodlines, but not memory. Not when it's spoken, not when it's past." The students were quiet. No one took photos. Some simply placed their hands on the soil. Milo walked to the center of the field. He carried a small wooden sign in his arms. On it were words carved in both Quechua and English, memorial to the Pachacuti lineage. He knelt, pressed it into the earth, and for a long moment no one moved. Then slowly voices began to murmur. One student began singing an old lullaby in Aymara. Another added harmony. It was the sound of something long buried breaking through surface. Milo stood back, and the camera pulled away, farther, higher, until the field became a symbol. Fade to a golden sky. A young Leonora stands alone on a hill. In her hands a tattered map. She looks toward the sun. Then the light engulfs her, and she is gone. The screen fades to black, but the wind keeps blowing, and the chimes keep singing.